A couple of weeks back more than a couple of weeks back now, at our AGM, we were talking again about our vision statement, and in particular, the with one another focus, which we're going to be kind of drilling into in the year ahead. The idea being that with an increased emphasis on building connection with one another, it better situates us both as a place where discipleship can happen effectively, which is kind of the toward Jesus part of our statement, and then also helps us to be a place that better embodies something reflective of the life of God and the kind of for our world part of our statement. And so as part of that, over the next 6 weeks, we're just going to be spending some time in a series which we've called Purposed Together, which is kind of looking at some of the big movements in the big story of Scripture from beginning to end, and asking in particular what it might say to us about God's purposeful work through community and through us. How might it speak to us in our context today? And so this morning is kind of right at the start of that story where it all begins in Genesis 1. And I want to read what will be probably very familiar words to many of us here from Genesis 1, verses 26 through to 31 as a kind of point of focus for us this morning. So feel free to have a look up at the screen as we read this through. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all of the creatures that move along the ground." And so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." And then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all of the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And Lord, as we just sit in these words right at the beginning of the Bible this morning, as we consider together what they might have to say to us in the spaces that we're sitting in here and now this morning, help us to hear what we need to hear in order that we would be who you want us to be, and that we would go and do what you want us to do. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So Genesis, this wonderful book of beginnings, it's an origin story which tells us something of why things are the way they are. It can also be a little bit of a tricky book at times, and if we were to head right back to the start of chapter 1, within a very few sentences actually, coming from what we know in our world today, we can find ourselves with a whole bunch of different questions and heading off down any number of rabbit holes. How does modern scientific theory align with the biblical perspective? What about evolution and big bangs and all of that kind of stuff? Or like at our dinner table, casual conversation the other week, where do the dinosaurs fit in? Why don't they get a shout out in the Genesis creation story there? And I think what we need to understand is that the kinds of questions that we might bring from our context today, sitting here this morning, are not actually the same questions that this text has much interest in answering. Certainly, questions of modern science are not on the radar for those who received this text in its original context. Rather, the questions that it is directing us to, the questions which this text is interested in answering, are much more, to borrow a couple of big words from our world today, they are questions of theology, as in this book has some big things to tell us about who God is, and then also anthropology, as in this text has something very important to say to us about who we are as people as well. So for example, a question that looms large in our world today is how? How did we all end up here? And the answer in Genesis, kind of in the first verse, is rather minimal and to the point. In the beginning, Genesis 1 verse 1, God created the heavens and the earth. How did all of this get here? Genesis says it's here because God made it. And then we get this poetic unpacking of creation which flows on from that. From nothingness, God speaks, and so formless and empty and dark is filled with light. There is sky and ground and sea, and then vegetation, and then stars and moon, and then, it doesn't say it, but use your imagination, kahawai and piwakawaka and tuatara and, livestock, all of that stuff. All of the things that we know God speaks into existence. And so while our questions sitting here this morning might be a little bit more complex in terms of process and method, the age of the earth and dinosaurs and all of that, Genesis isn't really interested in answering necessarily those questions. Instead, it is more about the simple affirmation to its original audience and to us that whatever we know, as we put our God-given intellects to work and learn more about the universe and all of its wonder, as different theories are explored and proven or otherwise, that all of that stuff is simply about uncovering more of the fingerprints of this wonderful creator through whose word all things spring into existence. Where it gets a little bit more tricky, I guess, in our context, comes when we move from the how question to another question that this text is interested in answering, which is why. Like, why does this all exist? Why are we all here? And it's here that from a biblical story, a biblical worldview perspective, we kind of have to depart a little bit from the agnosticism of science, because the why in Genesis is clearly not just about a biological mechanism working its way out. It's actually that in whatever mechanism is working in our world, there is a God behind it who is not just creating, but who is also actively embedding value and purpose into all things as well. And we see that beginning to unpack in the repeated refrain that kind of follows on in Genesis 1 as the creative process unfolds, underlined up there, and God saw that it was good. Creation is not neutral in the biblical story. There is a quality associated with creation. It is good. It exists as a testament to goodness. The sense of awe that we might feel as we stand and watch the sun setting one evening, or as we stand atop a mountain and look out at the view, maybe as we get up close to an elephant at the zoo, or as we kind of pause and gaze up at the stars at nighttime. That sense of kind of beauty and awe and all of that stuff that we feel, it's reflective of the goodness which God has placed within creation. Creation has value. Creation has a weight to it. God has called it good. But then it comes to verse 26 of Genesis 1, which is where our reading was this morning. And this is where we come in. Humankind is made, and the text specifies there that there is something special about us. God says, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. And there's two things that kind of jump off the page there that we might note almost straight away. There is a plural there, and there is an image there. First, there's the plural. Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. That's an unsubtle reminder, Andrew. Am I already over time? We only just got started. Yes. Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. And it's tempting, perhaps, and some do this, to kind of read back into this text a fully formed theology of the Trinity, kind of on the first page of the Bible. Others see this as God kind of speaking to the Spirit, which has been mentioned earlier on in the creation account. Others kind of see it as God kind of speaking communally to like the heavenly court as God is creating. And I guess irrespective of perspective, the unanimous implication here is that God creates out of community and so creates community. Male and female, he created them. In Genesis 2, which kind of switches the story up, and it's almost like coming at the same events from a different angle. This lens is reinforced even further in Genesis 2, verse 18. God's commentary on man's state after this succession of, and God saw that it was good. God sees there that it is not good for man to be alone. And so Eve is made, and there's this kind of then incredibly relational aspect to the why question of creation. And then, later on, as we kind of read into the New Testament, we realize that there is this theology of kind of relationship being at the heart of who God is, that God, at the center of God's self, is a loving, fellowshipping God, as we were being reminded in staff devotions on Tuesday morning this week. And so too then are those who are made in the image of this God, made for connection and community. Together, we are God's image. We are made to enjoy wonderful relationships with one another, but also with the one whose image that we bear. And you just turn a page over in Genesis and you see evidence of this. It's just kind of humanity existing alongside God in this garden space, kind of enjoying life together, doing life together. But there's more to the image stuff than just relationship. There are other purposes in this space as well. The same word which is used there for image in this text is one that is used elsewhere in the Old Testament to talk about idols of other gods. The kinds that would be set up inside of like a temple, for example, as a representation of that God for people to worship. Similar to kings in ancient times sending their likeness, in the form of a statue out into different corners of their empire so that everyone would know that it was them who was in charge. And there's something then quite profound about this idea that within the temple of creation, which God kind of knits and knits together and lives within, this kind of wonderful space of workmanship which testifies to the goodness of its creator. It is people, it is us together who are then set apart as image bearers of God. There is no idol in this temple because people are the image of God. And just like an idol is set up to deflect praise to the God it represents, so too humans are placed within creation to deflect praise to God. One writer puts it like this: the image is a vocation, it is a calling, it is the call to be an angled mirror reflecting God's wise order into the world and reflecting the praises of all creation back to the Creator. The image is a vocation, it's a calling, it is the call to be an angled mirror reflecting God's wise order into the world and reflecting the praises of all creation back to the Creator. Really important to notice here as well that while in other kind of ancient Near Eastern contexts, the other nations around these people who first received the text, think of spaces like Egypt, for example. The image of God in human form was a status that was just reserved entirely for royalty, right? But here in Genesis, the image of God is for all people. It is for all of us. It's not just for the special few. It is for every single one of us in our togetherness. We are gifted with the image of God, and we are purposed with it as well. And we see that purpose then playing out in the part which God envisages people to play. God said, "Let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals and all the creatures that move along the ground." There's this kind of language of being purposed for rule. this kind of royal language. And then we see that then playing out in the commission, which follows in verse 28. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, and then again rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. We are purposed as image bearers to rule within God's creation. But, and this is a really important but, to rule in a way that is reflective of the God who invests goodness into everything that he creates. And so these commissions here, they're not commissions for exploitation, they're not blessings for exploitation, they're not commissions to go and expend creation until there's nothing left of it. This is stewardship language that is being talked about here. One writer uses the analogy of you're looking for someone to come and house your house while you go away. They've got freedom to use your house. They can eat the food from the fridge. They can harvest your veggies in the garden. They can enjoy hanging out with your dog. All of that stuff. You don't expect then to come home and find that your house has been trashed and that the fridge is filled up with rotten food and that the dog is dead. You expect to find the house in the way it was left. Or another example, maybe this one will do it for you. Another author was reminding me of this week. Like in The Lion King, Mufasa and Simba are sitting out watching the light play out across the Pride Lands, and Mufasa says, look Simba, everything that the light touches is our kingdom. And Simba says, and this will all be mine. Everything you see exists in a delicate balance, says Mufasa. As king, you need to understand that balance and respect all the creatures, from the crawling ant to the leaping antelope. We are purposed in the Genesis story to apply the rule of God to creation, in keeping with the pattern of goodness for which it was intended to begin with, and keeping the balance with which it was all put together right at the start. And on the second page of the Bible in Genesis 2, what does that look like? Well, it looks like hanging out with God on a lazy afternoon, getting stuck in on a spot of gardening, and spending a bit of time naming the animals. But this kind of ruling idea, it shouldn't just be restricted in our imaginations to purely environmental output. This is, right at the start of the Bible, a valuing of the goodness of work. And the commissioning then for all of us in our different spheres of life to go and to outwork this idea of the rule of God into the way that we apply ourselves in all of the different parts of creation in which we walk. From the running of a household, just kind of the scheduling of parenting and all that goes with that, the time in the office, maybe time on the sports field, leisure time, friendships, even what we're doing here together this morning. We are sent to image the rule of God into God's creation. We are sent to be cultivators of the goodness which has been spoken over it. And so it is that God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. For fear of Andrew putting the clock back up again there, this is very much just scratching the surface on the first page of the Bible. But I guess the thought this morning that I want us to hold on to is that our origin story matters. It really matters. The original receivers of this text, they lived in a world of a whole bunch of different origin stories which told them something about who they were and about the gods, who the gods were that controlled their existence. One of the major mythologies of their time was that of Babylon, the ancient superpower, and it shares a few similarities in terms of some of its language with Genesis, but there, in this story, creation comes about not through a single God speaking creation into existence, but rather through a whole pantheon of gods going to war with one another. And the heavens and the earth are created because one of the gods is eviscerated and her body is cut in half and then formed into the ground and the sky. And in that story, humanity comes into existence because the gods just didn't want to do work in creation. And so, because they're lazy, one of the gods murders another god, and from his blood he created mankind, on whom he imposed the service of the gods and therefore set the gods free. You can imagine how dramatically different an account of the origins of humanity and of the world like this would be to the account that we find in Genesis, of how a story like this would be completely formative in an entirely different way from the story that we've been focusing on this morning. And I guess what I wanted to say is that, whether we know this Genesis story really, really well, or whether we are hearing it for the first time, we all, carry other origin stories with us, as it were. Stories of our meaning and our value and our purpose. Stories we've heard from other people about who we are. Stories that we might tell ourselves. And it has to be said that many of those stories are beautiful stories. Many of those stories are wonderful and good. They are stories that are reflective of the story that we have been looking at this morning. But many of us, we carry other stories. We carry stories which have spoken something different to us, stories which have diminished who we are, which have disempowered us, which have made us vulnerable, which have led us into kind of dark pathways and despair sometimes, questioning the very nature of our existence, questioning the very nature of God. And you'll know those stories if you carry them. I know those stories. I carry some of those stories with me as well. But I guess the encouragement of our text this morning is to be reminded again of something foundational, something deeper, something solid for us to be standing on. The encouragement of this part of the biblical story is that in a world which at times appears to be filled with nothing other than random chaos, perhaps a little bit more reflective of the Babylonian kind of worldview at times than anything else, the reminder is to be called back again into a faithful hope that this creator God who spoke continues to speak creation into existence and continues to work goodness into our world even today. The encouragement of this part of the biblical story is that in a world marked by rampant abuse of the created order, we're called back into a view of the inherent goodness of creation being a testimony to the wonder and majesty of God. The psalmist says that the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. In this world where we're so polarized, where we have diminished the humanity of the other, the one different from me, where these wedges have driven incredibly deep wounds of pain and suffering. Here in this story this morning, we are called back into an understanding of the incredible value and worth that we all carry as those who are the image of God, who are made to reflect the image of God into our world. We're called back into a hopeful perspective on humanity, of our neighbour, of those around us, even those who we might not especially like or agree with. Still there, we are encouraged to see them as bearers of dignity and value, which is far beyond our own estimation. In these opening pages of the biblical story, we hear again that we have been made for God, and we have been made for one another with
a purpose for a purpose, that together, somehow, in ways beyond our imagination, our ability to conceive, we have been made to reflect the goodness of our Creator into the world. And so I wonder this morning, where might this very simple encouragement, where might this reminder of your value and your purpose need to find its home in the story of your life even now? Where might this story need to find its home again in us as a community gathered around this God again this morning? Amen.